the scriptures of India, the Hindu, as well as the Quran, of course, and the Bible. And I started off with the study thinking that with one idea, that scripture was supposed to be not read, but listened to. Scriptures were always oral. The Quran means recitation. No one sits down and reads the Quran as a text. It would be like listening to a famous singer. You want to hear. It's a performance, and the chant and the music and the ritual is what makes scripture so important, because instead of just listening with your head, you are listening with all kinds of your body. We respond very deeply to music, for example. As soon as we hear music, our bodies start to move in a certain direction. And so I started off with that idea, that one thing leads to another. And I started finding all sorts of other things about scripture that they had in common. You start off on these books with one idea, and inevitably you end up saying something quite different.
Es muy interesante lo que dice de recitar, porque menciona usted en su libro la primera palabra que Dios transmite a Mahoma, justamente dice Ikra, dice habla, ¿no? Y estaba pensando lo que ocurre en las confesiones de San Agustín, cuando Agustín nos cuenta lo impresionado que se quedó él al ver a un monje, que luego resulta que era Ambrosio, que estaba leyendo él solo, porque no era costumbre que nadie estuviera leyendo solo, ¿no? O sea, estos textos eran como para ser recitados, compartidos, interpretados de una manera pues, social, colectiva.
Yes, so that's a lovely story when Augustine sees Ambrose reading the scriptures, and he can watch his mouth forming the words, but he's reading, but there's no sound coming out. It's one of those breakthrough moments when you realize how very differently we read scripture today, just concentrating in a very cerebral way on the text, without all these other rituals that involve the body, and music, and acting out a part, and gestures. When you're listening to the Quran, you begin very often with prostrations. The Muslim, when they pray, their foreheads touch the ground. And these bodily actions tell them at a level that's much deeper than the rational about what it means to surrender. With the word Islam means surrender your entire self to the divine. You learn it's by those gestures repeated several times every day. And when the call to prayer comes, the Muslim has to find out where the direction of Mecca is. So wherever he is in the world, he is facing in the direction of Mecca, and people have a little compass with them so that they can see exactly where they're supposed to be going. And again, that act, which seems a bit sort of odd and superstitious to a rational mind, it means that you are orienting yourself, directing yourself constantly in the direction of the divine, stopping what you are doing and putting yourself in another place, pointing to another way. That our body tells us all kinds of things that our minds don't take in. It's the part of it is what I found reading a lot of modern neurology, is that the right hemisphere of the brain is rather neglected in our modern world. We prefer the left hemisphere, which is excellent for mathematics and science and rationality. But really, the neurologists say we need both. Information enters our brains first in the right hemisphere, which sees the world in a much more holistic way. It sees the connections between things. It's with the right hemisphere that we listen to poetry and music and the arts. And it's also the seat of compassion, where again, you feel the connection with other people, with other things, with other beings. But then we need both hemispheres. We can't just exist in this haze. The information then passes to the left hemisphere, where we analyze it, discover what it means to us in this particular way, and then it passes to the right again, so that you're supposed to see them both. But now in the modern world, we have focused very much on rationality and mathematics, science, and this has done wonderful things for the world. Look at the tremendous advances of medicine, for example, that would have been impossible without this scientific endeavor we've had in the West. But it's made religion difficult for us. And as a result, I'm writing a new book at the moment, and finding out how very different the idea of God is in the modern world from what it was in the past, in the Christian world, and what the sacred or the divine means in other world traditions, which is a much more right hemispheric view of the world, where God is not stuck in heaven, God is everywhere. Thomas Aquinas says this very clearly when he's talking about God. He says, well, God is everywhere. God is not in a single place. But 100 years later, you have Descartes saying that the world is empty of God, that God created the world, he organized everything very nicely, scientifically, and then when he'd set it up, he retired to heaven. And now we're here on our own. Now, no other religion has any such view of a distant God. When the Jesuits in the 17th century went to China, many of the early Jesuits were very good scientists. And some of them here in Britain were members of the new Royal Society set up for scientific study in the 17th century here in London. And they took the new science that we developed in the West in the 17th century to China and took it to the Chinese literati. And the literati, the Confucians, were fascinated by the discoveries of Galileo and Copernicus, which have caused great uproar in Europe. People have been very disturbed by these findings, but they thought this was very interesting. But one of them writes, their science is very good, but oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, when they talk about what he calls seminal realities, the ultimate realities, about a God who seems confined or stuck in a tiny little portion of the universe, the heaven that he has created. He said, this is just nonsense. He said they don't understand the meaning of their words. We were developing a view of the divine in the West, which banishes God to the heavens. And there's an English hymn, the British hymn, that goes, well, very popular one, that goes addressing God, immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from all eyes. So God seems to us very, very distant, whereas in all the other traditions, God is seen very, very much so, infusing the whole of the natural world. In every tree or every breath of wind, every blade of grass inhabits the divine. In secularizing the world and depriving ourselves of that sense, that sacred view of the world, what we've done is use it simply as a commodity, with the dreadful environmental results that we're seeing today. And so this notion of a distant God and of scriptures as giving us somehow information about God, telling us, we read the scriptures for information. And people have complained that in the first chapter of Genesis, God, the third chapter of Genesis, I should say, Adam sins, and that Adam is supposed to have dominion over the world. He says, take the world and sort of look after it, be its master. And leading environmentalists have said, well, that's the problem. It all goes back to scripture. Scriptures say that human beings are the masters of the universe, and look what we've done to it. But people didn't read the scriptures like that in the old days. And if you look at the book of Genesis as a whole, you start off with this idea of God as totally powerful, totally benign. He blesses everything that he has made and says it is all very good. And he's totally impartial and fair. But the rest, and totally in control of the whole of creation. But the rest of the book of Genesis completely undercuts this notion. By the end of chapter 3 of Genesis, God has completely lost control of the creation. The human beings are doing what they want. The God that was so benign and had no favorites has monstrous favoritism, constantly choosing, for no good reason, Cain rather than Abel, Jacob rather than Esau. And there's no good reason for this. Esau may not have been the cleverest person in the world, but Jacob could be a very nasty piece of work sometimes. Why? And the benign creator who blesses all that he has made becomes a cruel destroyer at the time of the flood, wiping out nearly the whole of humanity in a fit of temper. And by the end of the book of Genesis, the God who was endlessly present and always coming down and telling people what to do has completely vanished from the scene. And Joseph and his brothers are left relying on their own dreams and insights, just as we have to do. And so the scripture, by the end of the book of Genesis, you don't know what God is. And that's what we should, that's good theology. Once we say we don't know what God is, that God is beyond us, that it doesn't fit our categories, then we've begun to sense what the sacred is.
Bueno, en su libro, como acaba de hacerlo ahora, usted señala que este olvido por parte de nuestro mundo, del mundo occidental, de ese otro hemisferio, digamos, de nuestro cerebro, nos ha permitido avanzar muchísimo en muchas cosas, pero al cierto tiempo tiene algo de amputación. Nos hemos amputado, incluso creo que nos hemos amputado un poco respecto al resto del mundo, porque en el resto del mundo las religiones están viviéndose también con una sensación mucho más vinculada al texto de las escrituras que dice usted, ¿no? A medida que vamos descubriendo cosas, vamos abriendo también más el mundo a nuevos secretos, a nuevos misterios. Las respuestas siguen estando ahí detrás, ¿no? Así que le parece una amputación. Esto que está haciendo el mundo occidental ahora, alejando la idea de Dios por completo, separándola por completo, incorporándola a las creencias individuales, ¿le parece a usted una amputación? No le parece un paso adelante, sino un paso atrás, ¿no, Karen?
Yes, I think you're right. Here in Britain, we're extremely unreligious. Only about 10% of the population attend a religious service regularly, and most of those are Muslims. And Britain is one of the worst markets for my books. My own best friends don't read my books. They think I'm mad to be writing about this discredited stuff. But the rest, you're right, the rest of the world, and even in the United States, which was a country founded by the Enlightenment, people are religious there, far more religious than they are in most of Europe. And the rest of the world, certainly, most of the rest of the world is religious. And the environmental crisis, for example, people wanted Western science, obviously, for very good reasons, for medicine, as we've said, and all the technological advances that we've got from this. But they have not abandoned these ancient, these more traditional beliefs of the sacred as everywhere, as the divine in every blade of grass. And interestingly, the Quran is much more attuned to the natural world and celebrates the natural world much more so than the Bible does. The Quran, in the Quran, the signs, what they call the ayat, the signs of nature, you're meant to look at the with the right hemisphere of the brain and see how beautifully everything fits together. And the natural world is just as important a source of revelation as the Quran. And so, and Islam is in many ways, in some parts of the Muslim world, is very, it's a very bowdlerized, limited form of Islam, say in Saudi Arabia. But when I go to Pakistan a lot, people are yearning to hear about God. You can hear almost a pin drop when you speak about the divine to very secular looking Pakistanis. Those eyes filled with tears. And I think even in China, Confucian ideas are so deeply embedded in the Chinese psyche that is all still there, despite the recent communist secularist regimes. We are behind, and we need a sense of religion, I think, because the religions tell us two things. One is to have the most important thing is to respect all peoples, whoever they are. Love your enemies, said Jesus. Go out, reach out to all tribes and nations, says the Quran. And in India, when people greet each other, they join their hands and bow because they're acknowledging the sacred that is in that human being. But we've lost that. And just as we've used nature as a commodity and are wrecking it with the environmental catastrophes, we've also used human beings as a resource. Look at the United States, which began with the Enlightenment secularist ideals and preached rationality, and it was the start of the Enlightenment in a way. But you also have the crime of slavery, industrial slavery on a major scale, which we're now seeing in the Black Lives Movement, the pain that people have suffered for all this time, and the Native Americans. Even Thomas Jefferson, the epitome of the Enlightenment, told his officers that the Native Americans had to be driven over the Mississippi to dwell with the wild beasts. And during this recent pandemic, medical supplies and help with the pandemic have not been sent, say, to the Navajo communities, the tribal communities, the indigenous communities in the United States, which are suffering, among the young particularly, huge despair. And suicide among the Native American young is at a very high level. So for all our talk about equality and freedom and rationality, what the religions tell us is that the human being is like the natural world incarnates the divine, has that God is in the human being, that the sacred is in the human being, and that we must, it's essential to all the religious traditions that we practice the golden rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself.
Un aspecto destacadísimo también de las escrituras es eso que señala usted, que todas ellas, lo mismo las del libro, las de los hijos de Abraham, el islamismo, el judaísmo, el cristianismo, que en la India o en China, etcétera, tienen un denominador común: la empatía, la misericordia, digamos, el respeto por la vida de los demás, la justicia social, diríamos. Es un rasgo muy interesante, señala usted, que todos y cada uno de los libros, sean cuales sean y escritos en cualquier lugar, todos tienen ese denominador común, ese rasgo de solidaridad, de misericordia o de piedad, de justicia social.
Absolutely right. And this, it goes right back to the very beginning, to the earliest scriptures. They all have what we call the golden rule. First proposed in a way that was written down by Confucius way back 6th century BC, where he's asked, what is the single thread that runs through all your teaching, and what pulls it? And he answered with the Chinese ren, which means humanity, or it's very difficult to translate it, humanity. And then he says, do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. That this must apply also to the way you treat in an aristocratic Chinese society, the peasantry, what they call the mean, the little people. You must go among them as if you're in the presence of an important guest. And it's in the Bible. The great Rabbi Hillel, when he was asked to sum up the whole of Jewish teaching while he stood on one leg and said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being. That is the Torah, and everything else is only commentary. Everything else in the Torah is just a commentary on that essential point of utter respect for human beings. And in the Indian tradition, they say that the divine, the Atman, which pervades the whole of humanity, is also in the heart of every single human being, which is why, as I've said, they make that obeisance when they meet one another. And Jesus went further. He said to love your enemies. The word he would have used probably is hesed, which means compassion, mercy, etc. But that, unless we now treat our so-called enemies today with the respect that we wish to have for ourselves, the world is simply not going to be a viable place. And right now, I don't know how it is in Spain, but during this pandemic, the rhetoric in the press has been absolutely vicious, attacking this, attacking that, and with horrible language, attacking institutions, for example. I'm very much involved with the British Museum here in London, and there's all this talk about restitution. This is a complicated matter, but the abuse hurled at the museum and at its director has been absolutely lethal. This is pulling our society apart. This is not we're not a religious country, but we're very devoted, we say, to equality and fairness, and this is not the case. And unless now, as I say, we take this commandment seriously, which it's the only way human beings are going to be able to relate to one another, is to see the other person as sacred. And the fact that the other person is often unknown to us, this is a challenge. It reminds us that we don't know what the sacred is either, that we're encountering a great mystery in every single human being. I don't know about you, but I'm often a mystery to myself I wonder, why on earth did you say that? Why did you do that? We take ourselves by surprise. So if we're constantly surprising ourselves, well, of course, we should also be surprised and amazed, and not to find differences in the other and see that as an enriching thing. The last words I think the Prophet Muhammad spoke to the community before his death was that he said, he told Muslims they must never fight one another, that Muslims were brothers. And then he quotes a verse from the Quran in which God says, not just to the Muslim world, but to the whole of humanity, "O people, we have formed you all from a single male and a single female, so that you may get to know one another." And I think that's the challenge for us today. We've all been created from a single man and a single woman. So each one of us is a union of contradiction. We have two opposites coming together to form a new person. And that explains the contradiction we all experience within our own selves. But we must use that sense of contradiction and puzzlement to reach out, to get to know other people, to all tribes and nations, to all people in the world. And the Chinese have a practice that goes right back to the very, very earliest days of China, long before Confucius, that sees goodwill and compassion reaching out in a series of concentric circles. You begin by practicing compassion and empathy in the family. And it's very strict in China as it developed. Each family member has to look after another family member. So the elder son will take great care of his parents, and he will bring them their food. He will see that they look after them at every moment of the day, serving them. But his younger brother will have to give that service to his older brother. And so it goes around so that each member of the family receives a measure of absolute respect and learns to value him or herself. But you can't stop in the family, says the Chinese. You then must reach out in the first concentric circle to the city in which you live. And that means you must practice compassion and respect to everybody in the city. But it doesn't stop there. You then reach out in compassion to the whole country. And then finally, to the whole world. Always it finishes with the whole world. You must be reaching out continually to the whole world. This is the challenge for us in our global world, which has suddenly shrunk. I mean, the Chinese had no conception of how large the world was when they were bringing making those ideas. But now the world is a very small place. And unless we learn now to pay that absolute respect to people, whether they like it or not, whether we like them or not, however strange they are to us, remember that strangeness we have in ourselves, that when we encounter strangeness and contradiction within ourselves, that is, the scriptures all tell us that in different ways. The Chinese have it put it very well, and they have meditations when they make themselves do that, sending out messages or feelings of empathy and goodwill, continually going outward, outward, and outward.
A partir de la aceptación de la propia contradicción. Porque estaba recordando Hermann Hesse cuando decía, yo soy pues un poco cobarde y un poco valiente. Algunos días soy muy generoso, otros días soy muy poco generoso. Unos días soy muy progresista y otros días soy muy conservador. Incluso en horas, ¿no? Aceptar nuestra propia complejidad. Señor Armstrong, en el tema de las escrituras, a lo largo de la historia ha habido como dos corrientes de interpretación. La interpretación literal de los textos como algo hermético, cerrado, concluido definitivamente ya, y que ha de ser obedecido literalmente, y la teoría de los textos como procesos en construcción, y además en sucesivos procesos de interpretación, ya cuando llega pues, el protestantismo, etcétera, pues, Descartes y la imprenta, y empiezan a enfrentarse cada uno consigo mismo, y empiezan a poderse interpretar las cosas de una manera más abierta, ¿no? Estas dos miradas están en el centro también de la historia de las Sagradas Escrituras. Algunas veces han conducido a enormes catástrofes y grandes conflictos por la interpretación literal de la ley. ¿Cómo hemos de interpretar las Sagradas Escrituras, señora Armstrong? Como textos cerrados, literalmente tapiados, o como textos abiertos a la interpretación, como textos todavía en construcción.
The older, more traditional way is to see them as always open, to see them always as something new. And to put contradictions side by side, to say, right, we don't know, to allow that to happen. The literal mode of interpretation comes in very much with the modern world, with the left hemispheric modern world. It starts in places like here in England with our scientific revolution, where science has to take things literally. And so we're doing that in the same way, but that's not the traditional way. There's a very famous Sufi mystic, Ibn al-Arabi, who says that, 12th century, he's revered as a Sheikh al-Aqsa, the very great Sheikh, revered by both Sufi and Shia and Sunni. And he says that every time you recite the Quran, it should mean something different to you. And notice he says recite. You're not reading it for information, you're reciting it, and that's an art form, and the music and the beauty is taking you, but because God has something to say for you here and now. So the text should mean something different to you today than it did when you read it yesterday. In the Jewish world too, Midrash, the rabbinic mode of interpretation, is always to make something entirely different, make something entirely new from the text, to give it an entirely new meaning. And even here in Europe, before the Reformation, people read each bit of scripture, or recited it, one should say, because most people, we have to say, couldn't read. Only a very few members of the population were literate. So you listen to your scripture always in the traditional way, in the context of the Mass. But when you listen to scripture, to each verse, you applied 4 different ways of interpretation. You start with the literal sense, what is this actually saying? Then you move on to the allegorical sense, and it makes something entirely different. Then you move to the moral sense, and what is this saying to me now? And you interpret it so that the text is speaking to you in your particular circumstance, which the original prophets couldn't have known anything about at all. And finally, you move to the eschatological sense, where you see it in the light of heaven, or in the light of God. So it's a set of an ascent from the literal mode up to the mysterious, and that is very typical throughout the scriptures. If you look at the Indian scriptures, if you just look even at one sector of them, the Upanishads, they all have completely different ideas. These are great scriptures, but they all have completely ideas of what the world is, how we should relate to it, how we should best pray. And because when you're confronting the sacred text, you're confronting the divine, and therefore you're not knowing anything. But you see, in our world, we are educated at school in a rational way, which is good. You can't just go around the world in a sort of mystical haze. But that has trained us. And when we read something, we expect it, and we're told it's an authoritative text. We now are making it true, and literally true, and it's completely distorting the way people read scripture. No one would have done it like that in the olden times. Scripture was always a work in progress. It was there in the past, but you can have new scriptures, new thoughts, and it has to be applied to you here and now in a creative way. So this is making the whole idea of God difficult to us too, because what is God? I was up in the Catholic Catechism. That was a question, and I had, at the age of 8 years old, this was the answer. What is God? God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. Well, frankly, at the age of 8, that didn't mean very much to me, but I learned to recite it and chant it, of course. But I now think it's entirely incorrect. God is not a spirit. It's not even the Supreme Spirit. God is all that is. God, Thomas Aquinas said, does not exist. God, says Thomas Aquinas, is not one of the things that exist, because he's not like this computer or me or you or these books that we have around us. These things all exist. God is not like that, says Aquinas. God is esse se ipsum, being itself. God is what gives all these things, all of us, the whole world, being. It is the essence of it. So to say God is a being or a spirit, even the Supreme Spirit, is inaccurate. We are completely making religion very, very difficult for ourselves. Also, these texts make no sense to us unless you put them into practice. It would be like reading you can't learn to drive by reading the car manual. You have to get into the vehicle and learn how to manipulate the brakes, and then you can drive. You have to translate that theory into action. And until and unless we take the scriptures and put them into practice in a way, especially that emphasizes the compassionate element, then we're not reading them properly. Now, a lot of these scriptures have violence in them. And so you've got a lot of people today in, say, as we know in the Muslim world, who take bits of the Quran and justify it and interpret it literally to justify their atrocities. But this is not how you're supposed to read scripture, because interestingly, I found out that these texts that the jihadis are quoting, they were said by the first great Muslim exegetes who studied scripture, who studied the Quran. They said that these texts are no longer viable. These texts applied to particular moments in the Prophet Muhammad's life, and they're not applicable to us anymore. For example, they're talking about going and killing these people in a battle down the road in the Jahilun, the people who are godless. There are no more godless people in Arab now. They're all Muslims. So none of these things apply. It's only these texts only became popular in about the 14th century. They weren't popular, but exegetes and people started to read them in a literal, more aggressive manner during what we call the Middle Ages, because at that time the Muslims were being attacked on two fronts. They had the great Mongol crusades, as it were, the great Mongol invasions that took away whole swathes of Muslim land, whole masses of Muslim territory. And as we know, the Mongols committed great violence. On the other side, you've got the Crusaders, Christian Crusaders, continually attacking the Muslim world from the West. Particularly, and some of the first of the Muslims who started taking these jihadi texts literally lived in Spain because of the Reconquista. When I was in Oviedo receiving the Asturias Prize, I was sitting with the Queen Mother, and she said, well, Islam is a very violent religion. And I said, well, Christianity has been violent too. I said, look, we are sitting right now in the Hotel Reconquista. And she had to laugh. It was that this violence began with attacks from the West, from the East. And that's when those texts, for the first time after about 600 or 700 years since the Prophet's death, these texts were interpreted literally. Up until then, they had been discounted. And similarly, the ideas of who created the world and how God created the world, nobody took this literally. In the first chapter of Genesis, you've got one vision of the creation of the world. Then throughout the Psalms, you've got God bringing the world into creation by fighting monsters. There's this. You need to see that scriptures are not giving a clear, unequivocal message. They are confronting you with a situation, and if you read them wholly and entirely, you must keep the compassionate ethos in mind.
Bueno, vamos a concluir, Karen, con una perspectiva que a mí me parece que es muy interesante en su libro. Usted señala que las escrituras tienen dentro el germen de unas grandes posibilidades de paz en el mundo. O sea, dice eso, las escrituras han producido a lo largo de la historia, como consecuencia de interpretaciones literales, etcétera, algunos horrores, pero el mundo podría buscar caminos de paz si fuera capaz de entender los mensajes de las escrituras. Si le parece, terminamos con este mensaje porque me parece muy positivo. ¿Cree usted, Karen, que en efecto hay ahí una semilla de paz muy importante para el futuro del mundo?
Yes, I do, but you have to take this literally. What the scriptures are all saying one way and another is that in order to create a peaceful and compassionate world, we have to practice what the Greeks call kenosis, which means an emptying of self, a getting beyond the self, getting beyond ego, getting beyond selfishness, getting beyond the instinct we have to look at things from my perspective. And that's why, as I think I said earlier, Muslims bow down with their face on the ground like a slave to teach their bodies at a level deeper than the rational what it means to give up that ego we all have, where we prance and preen ourselves, endlessly try to make ourselves look clever and brilliant and interesting. Let all that go. They all insist upon that. And you have it in the whole idea of Jesus, the whole idea of incarnation, of God becoming a helpless baby, in a sense, God being there present in a helpless child. And that is very difficult for us today, because we're always being told to realize ourselves. We're going for self-fulfillment, and we tend to aggrandize the self. And that applies nationally too. The whole business of nationalism, we are suffering this at the moment in the UK. great sort of discussions here about, as a certain concert we have every year, whether we should sing Rule Britannia or Land of Hope and Glory, which Britain is no longer a land of hope or glory. But so we shouldn't be singing these things anymore because it makes our hearts swell and we all feel wonderful and proud. This has to go. And I think that the scriptures are telling us about that to give up this ego, which makes us denigrate others in order to enhance the self, to make ourselves seem superior. That is a fundamental message going right the way through. And so there is that seed of peace, but our culture doesn't seem to encourage that. But it should encourage us. I mean, here in Britain, we made such a mess of the pandemic, for example. Our government, such a disastrous mess. And this recent problem with Brexit, for example, with our Prime Minister doing really unmentionable things. This should not make us think that Britannia rules the waves anymore. We should use this in Britain to make ourselves feel small and sorry and realize how futile and stupid we are. And all of us are like this. We need to take the scriptures help to do that with their rituals, with the ritual of bowing when you see one another, to realize that the other is as holy or just as holy as you. But it has to be translated practically into practical action, as Confucius said, all day and every day.
Muchas gracias, Karen Armstrong. Ha sido un honor, Karen Armstrong, premio Princesa de Asturias, autora de este libro formidable. Que, bueno, tiene una gran cantidad de información, de una cantidad de documentación, una gran cantidad de reflexión, una gran cantidad de cosas, hasta de curiosidades. A mí me ha llamado mucho. Yo no sabía que Yahvé era uno de los hijos de él, uno del gran dios de Canaán. O sea, aquí hay desde reflexiones muy profundas hasta curiosidades muy interesantes. Muchísimas gracias, Karen. Ha sido un honor. Un saludo.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.